You think the cooking methods your grandmother swore by were just old-fashioned superstition? Think again. Modern science has vindicated kitchen practices that health authorities once condemned as dangerous. Here are 30 banned cooking tricks from the 1960s that scientists now call genius. Cooking in cast iron skillets was once dismissed as outdated by cookware manufacturers pushing aluminum and Teflon alternatives during the 1960s. Families who clung to their grandmother's heavy black pans were told they were living in the past. Yet scientists now confirm that cast iron cooking increases dietary iron intake significantly, particularly when preparing acidic foods like tomatoes. The iron leaches into food in forms the body can absorb, providing natural supplementation no pill can match. Women and children benefited most from this unintentional fortification, preventing anemia in households that couldn't afford expensive red meat. The seasoning that built up over decades created a natural non-stick surface without synthetic chemicals that later proved concerning. Those black skillets passed through generations weren't just sentimental keepsakes. They delivered measurable health benefits that took science 50 years to recognize and validate. Rendering and cooking with lard was standard practice in the 1960s kitchens before vegetable shortening and seed oils dominated grocery shelves. Health authorities warned families that animal fats would clog arteries, pushing them toward hydrogenated alternatives that seemed modern and clean. Decades later, scientists discovered those replacement products contained trans fats far more dangerous than anything in traditional lard. Pure lard from pastured pigs contains oleic acid, the same heart-healthy monounsaturated fat praised in olive oil, along with vitamin D that plant oils cannot provide. The smoke point proved higher than most vegetable oils, making it safer for high-heat frying without creating harmful compounds. Pie crusts made with lard achieved flakiness that shortening never matched. The generation that abandoned their grandmother's lard bucket for Crisco cans traded genuine nutrition for industrial convenience that science now regrets promoting. Simmering bones for hours to make rich broth seemed wasteful to efficiency-minded 1960s homemakers being sold canned alternatives. Campbell's and other manufacturers promised convenience while dismissing homemade stock as unnecessary labor. Modern nutrition research has vindicated the old ways, revealing that bone broth delivers collagen, glycine, and minerals in bioavailable forms that support gut health, joint function, and skin elasticity. The gelatin released during long simmering creates protein structures that help heal intestinal lining damaged by processed foods. Glucosamine extracted naturally from cartilage provides joint support without expensive supplements. Grandmothers who refused to throw away chicken carcasses or beef bones weren't being cheap. They were practicing nutritional wisdom that pharmaceutical companies now bottle and sell for premium prices. The stockpot simmering on the back burner represented genuine wealth that no convenience product could replicate. Home fermentation of vegetables was actively discouraged by food safety authorities during the 1960s, who warned families about botulism from homemade pickles and sauerkraut. Store-bought versions pasteurized with vinegar seemed safer and more reliable. Scientists now understand that traditional lactofermentation creates conditions where beneficial bacteria thrive while harmful pathogens cannot survive, producing probiotics that support immune function and digestive health in ways pasteurized products never can. The process preserved vegetables through winter while actually increasing their nutritional value, creating vitamins absent from fresh produce. Fermented foods populated the gut with diverse microorganisms now recognized as essential for mental health and weight regulation. Families who maintained crocks of fermenting cabbage weren't risking their health. They were cultivating living foods that modern probiotic supplements attempt to replicate at far greater expense. Adding generous amounts of butter or bacon fat to vegetables was considered nutritional sabotage during the low-fat obsession emerging in the 1960s. Health experts insisted vegetables should be steamed plain or eaten raw to maximize their benefits. Research now confirms that fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K require dietary fat for proper absorption, meaning naked vegetables deliver far less nutrition than those prepared with traditional fats. Carotenoids in carrots, lycopene in tomatoes, and other crucial compounds pass through the digestive system largely unutilized, without accompanying fat. Grandmothers who fried green beans in bacon drippings or sautéed spinach in butter weren't ruining healthy food. They were dramatically increasing its nutritional availability. The practice also made vegetables palatable enough that children actually ate them willingly. Science now recommends exactly what common sense already knew. Some fat makes everything about vegetables work better. Saving and reusing bacon grease in ceramic crocks beside the stove was standard kitchen practice that modernization nearly eliminated. Food writers and health advocates condemned the habit as unsanitary and unhealthy, promoting spray oils and margarine as cleaner alternatives. Bacon fat contains roughly 40% saturated fat, but also 45% monounsaturated oleic acid, the same compound that gives olive oil its health halo. The rendered fat proved remarkably stable, resisting oxidation that makes polyunsaturated vegetable oils go rancid and potentially harmful. Using bacon grease for frying eggs, seasoning beans, or starting gravies added depth of flavor no industrial product could match. The practice eliminated waste, stretched food budgets, and delivered genuine taste that made simple meals memorable. Families who never threw away bacon drippings were practicing sustainable cooking that modern chefs now celebrate. Eating liver, kidneys, and other organ meats weekly was routine in the 1960s households, before factory farming and supermarket convenience made such foods seem primitive. Muscle meats became the only acceptable protein while organs were relegated to pet food. Nutritional science now recognizes organ meats as the most nutrient-dense foods available, containing concentrated vitamins and minerals that muscle tissue cannot provide. Liver alone delivers more vitamin A, B12, folate, copper, and iron per ounce than any other food, supporting energy production and preventing deficiencies affecting millions today. Heart provides CoQ10 essential for cellular energy. Kidneys offer selenium and B vitamins in exceptional quantities. The generation that regularly consumed these foods experienced fewer deficiency-related health problems, despite having less access to supplements. What seemed like poverty eating was actually nutritional abundance that affluence foolishly abandoned. Drinking whole milk and eating full-fat dairy products was common practice before low-fat recommendations transformed the dairy case into a parade of skim and reduced-fat options. Parents were told that removing fat would make dairy healthier for growing children and weight-conscious adults. Decades of research now show that full-fat dairy consumers have lower rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease compared to those choosing reduced-fat alternatives. The natural fats in whole milk slow sugar absorption, provide fat-soluble vitamins in bioavailable forms, and signal satiety that prevents overeating. Removing fat concentrated the lactose sugar while eliminating the components that made dairy genuinely nourishing. Children raised on whole milk from the family cow or local dairy received complete nutrition that skim milk simply cannot provide. The fat phobia that transformed American dairy consumption may have contributed to the very health problems it claimed to prevent. Fermenting foods without commercial starters or precise temperature control seemed reckless to food scientists promoting standardized production during the 1960s. Wild fermentation relied on naturally occurring bacteria and yeasts that authorities viewed as unpredictable and dangerous. Traditional fermenters understood that proper salt concentration, anaerobic conditions, and patience created environments where beneficial organisms outcompeted harmful ones without external intervention. The resulting diversity of probiotic strains far exceeded anything commercial starters could provide, creating products with complex flavors and genuine health benefits. Sourdough bread made from wild-captured yeasts offered superior nutrition compared to commercial yeast versions. Naturally fermented pickles and sauerkraut contained living cultures that pasteurized products couldn't match. The wisdom embedded in traditional fermentation practices predated scientific understanding but achieved what laboratory methods later struggled to replicate. Heavy salting of meat for preservation was abandoned when refrigeration became universal, and health authorities began warning about sodium consumption. The practice seemed unnecessary when freezers could preserve food indefinitely without additives. Yet salt curing did far more than prevent spoilage. It created beneficial compounds, developed complex flavors, and improved the nutritional profile of preserved meats in ways freezing never could. The curing process encouraged beneficial bacteria while inhibiting pathogens, creating fermented products with probiotic potential. Salt-preserved meats developed concentrated flavors, requiring smaller portions to satisfy, potentially reducing overall consumption. Traditional hams and bacons prepared with proper salt curing contained enzymes and compounds that modern quick-cured versions lack entirely. The craft of salt preservation represented accumulated wisdom about food chemistry that industrial shortcuts eliminated while claiming improvement. Eating eggs daily was condemned by health authorities who believed dietary cholesterol directly caused heart disease. The American Heart Association warned families to limit eggs to 3 per week, treating them as dangerous indulgences rather than nutritional powerhouses. Modern research has completely reversed this position, finding no connection between egg consumption and cardiovascular risk in healthy individuals. The cholesterol in eggs actually helps the body produce hormones, build cell membranes, and synthesize vitamin D. Eggs provide complete protein with all essential amino acids, plus choline critical for brain function that most Americans lack. The yolks contain lutein and zeaxanthin that protect aging eyes from macular degeneration. Farm families who ate eggs daily from their backyard flocks weren't shortening their lives. They were consuming one of nature's most perfect foods. The decades of egg restriction may have contributed to widespread choline deficiency, now linked to liver disease and cognitive decline. Cooking with beef tallow was standard practice in restaurants and home kitchens before health campaigns convinced Americans that vegetable oils were superior. McDonald's famously switched from tallow to vegetable oil for frying in 1990 after years of pressure, and customers immediately noticed the difference in taste. Scientists now understand that tallow's saturated fat structure makes it remarkably stable at high temperatures, resisting the oxidation that creates harmful compounds in polyunsaturated oils during frying. The fatty acid profile closely resembles human fat composition, making it easily utilized by the body. Tallow provided vitamins A, D, E, and K in forms that plant oils cannot deliver. The switch to vegetable oils may have increased inflammation and oxidative stress in populations consuming fried foods regularly. Those crispy fries and fried chicken from the 1960s weren't just tastier. They were cooked in fat that science now recognizes as genuinely healthier for high-heat applications. Drinking raw milk directly from the farm was common practice before pasteurization became legally mandated in most states. Health authorities insisted that heating milk was essential for safety, dismissing claims that raw milk offered superior nutrition as dangerous nostalgia. Research now shows that pasteurization destroys beneficial enzymes, probiotics, and heat-sensitive vitamins present in fresh milk. The lactase enzyme naturally occurring in raw milk helps people digest lactose who otherwise cannot tolerate dairy. Beneficial bacteria in raw milk from healthy animals compete with and suppress pathogens naturally. Children raised on raw milk show lower rates of allergies, asthma, and eczema compared to those drinking pasteurized versions. The immunoglobulins and growth factors in fresh milk support immune development in ways processed milk cannot. Farm families who continued drinking raw milk weren't reckless. They maintained access to a living food that processing fundamentally transforms. Soaking grains and beans overnight before cooking was dismissed as unnecessary fussiness by convenience-focused 1960s food writers promoting quick cooking methods. Modern recipes skip this traditional step entirely, treating it as wasted time. Nutrition science has revealed that soaking activates enzymes that break down phytic acid, a compound that binds minerals and prevents their absorption. Unsoaked grains and legumes can actually deplete mineral stores rather than nourish, creating deficiencies despite apparent adequate intake. The soaking process also begins breaking down complex starches and proteins, improving digestibility and reducing the gas and bloating many people experience. Traditional cultures worldwide practiced soaking, sprouting, or fermenting grains precisely because ancestral wisdom recognized what modern shortcuts ignore. Grandmothers who started their beans the night before weren't being inefficient. They were unlocking nutrition that quick-cooked versions simply cannot provide. using every part of the animal from snout to tail was considered primitive by 1960s, Americans enjoying post-war prosperity and supermarket convenience. Muscle meats became the only respectable protein, while bones, organs, and odd bits were discarded or hidden in pet food. Traditional butchery practices that utilized everything represented accumulated wisdom about nutrition that affluence carelessly abandoned. Bones provided minerals, collagen, and gelatin. Organs delivered concentrated vitamins impossible to obtain from muscle meat alone. Skin and cartilage supplied glycine and proline essential for joint health and tissue repair. Fat provided energy and fat-soluble vitamins in stable, usable forms. The nose-to-tail approach that seemed backward actually delivered complete nutrition that eating only boneless, skinless chicken breasts never could. Modern chefs now celebrate whole animal cooking as sophisticated gastronomy, but farm families and frugal grandmothers practiced it out of wisdom that science finally validates. Slow cooking meats at low temperatures for hours was standard practice before microwave ovens and time-saving appliances promised faster results. Home economists promoted quick cooking methods as modern and efficient, dismissing long braises as wasteful. Research now confirms that slow cooking at low temperatures breaks down tough connective tissue into gelatin, while preserving nutrients that high heat destroys. The collagen conversion creates silky textures and releases amino acids like glycine that support gut health and sleep quality. Tough, cheap cuts from working muscles become tender and flavorful through patience that expensive cuts don't require. The Maillard reaction develops complex flavors during extended cooking that quick methods cannot replicate. Grandmothers who kept pot roasts simmering all afternoon weren't being inefficient. They practiced techniques that transform inexpensive ingredients into deeply nourishing meals. The slow cooker revival proves that older methods simply work better. Sun-drying fruits, vegetables, and meats was practiced for millennia before refrigeration made fresh food available year-round. Food scientists dismissed traditional drying as primitive preservation that modern canning and freezing had rendered obsolete. Yet sun-drying concentrates nutrients, develops complex flavors through enzymatic changes, and creates shelf-stable foods without the energy costs of refrigeration. Dried tomatoes develop umami compounds absent from fresh ones. Dried fruits concentrate minerals and fiber while remaining portable and storable for months. Traditional dried meats like jerky preserve protein without refrigeration while developing flavors that fresh meat lacks. The process eliminates water that bacteria need while preserving vitamins and enzymes that heat processing destroys. Families who maintained drying racks and knew which foods preserved best weren't clinging to outdated methods. They practiced sustainable food preservation that industrial alternatives merely imitate. Cooking with wine, beer, and spirits was standard practice in home kitchens before concerns about alcohol consumption made such ingredients seem inappropriate for family cooking. Health-conscious cooks questioned whether adding wine to sauces or beer to batters was really necessary or advisable. Food science confirms that alcohol serves multiple culinary functions beyond flavor enhancement. It acts as a solvent, extracting flavor compounds from herbs and aromatics that water and fat cannot reach. The alcohol itself largely evaporates during cooking, leaving behind complex flavors impossible to achieve otherwise. Wine's acidity tenderizes proteins and brightens sauces naturally. Beer's carbonation creates lighter batters and bread. Spirits and marinades break down tough fibers more effectively than acidic alternatives. Grandmothers who added a splash of sherry to soup or brandy to desserts weren't being indulgent. They employed techniques that professional chefs consider fundamental to sophisticated cooking. Using vinegar liberally in cooking and as a daily tonic was common practice before pharmaceutical approaches to health displaced traditional remedies. Apple cider vinegar with the mother culture was kept in pantries and consumed diluted in water each morning by health-conscious families. Modern research validates many traditional claims about vinegar's benefits, showing it helps regulate blood sugar response when consumed with meals, supports beneficial gut bacteria, and aids mineral absorption from foods. The acetic acid in vinegar improves insulin sensitivity and may reduce fat storage after eating. Vinegar-based dressings on salads increase absorption of fat-soluble nutrients from vegetables. Pickling vegetables in vinegar preserved them, while adding probiotic potential that plain vegetables lacked. The grandmother who started each day with diluted apple cider vinegar and added splashes to cooking wasn't following superstition. She practiced dietary habits that clinical trials now support. Eating saturated fat from butter, meat, and coconut was demonized by nutrition authorities who promoted polyunsaturated vegetable oils as heart-healthy alternatives. Families were told to replace butter with margarine, lard with Crisco, and coconut oil with corn oil to prevent cardiovascular disease. Decades of research have failed to prove that saturated fat causes heart disease, while trans fats in the recommended replacements proved genuinely dangerous. Saturated fats provide stable energy, support hormone production, and help absorb fat-soluble vitamins essential for health. The brain itself is largely composed of saturated fat and cholesterol that dietary sources help maintain. Populations consuming traditional diets high in saturated fat from whole foods show excellent cardiovascular health. The generation that followed official advice to avoid saturated fat may have replaced genuinely nourishing foods with processed alternatives that contributed to the very diseases they were meant to prevent. Marinating meats in acidic liquids overnight was considered excessive by 1960s cooking authorities who recommended brief marination to avoid making meat mushy. Food scientists now confirm that extended marination in wine, citrus, or vinegar breaks down tough proteins and connective tissue far more effectively than brief soaking. The acids penetrate deeply over hours, tenderizing economical cuts that would otherwise require long cooking. Enzymatic marinades using papaya, pineapple, or ginger work even faster, breaking down muscle fibers while adding complex flavors. The process also creates conditions inhospitable to harmful bacteria, actually improving food safety. Grandmothers who started marinades the night before understood that patients with tough cuts yielded results that expensive steaks couldn't match. The flavors developed during overnight marination penetrated completely rather than just coating the surface. Traditional marination techniques represented food chemistry wisdom that shortcuts cannot replicate. Basting roasts repeatedly with pan drippings was dismissed as unnecessary fussiness by efficiency-focused 1960s cooks who trusted self-basting roasting bags and covered pans. Opening the oven repeatedly seemed wasteful of heat and time. Research confirms that traditional basting serves multiple purposes beyond adding moisture. The fat in drippings browns and crisps the exterior through the Maillard reaction, creating flavor compounds impossible to achieve otherwise. The repeated coating builds layers of caramelized sugars and proteins that form a flavorful crust. Basting also distributes heat more evenly across the roast surface, promoting uniform cooking. The aromatic compounds in herbs and vegetables added to the pan become concentrated in the drippings and transfer to the meat with each application. Grandmothers who stood over their roasts with spoons weren't being obsessive. They were practicing technique that transforms ordinary meat into something memorable and deeply satisfying. Resting meat after cooking before carving was often skipped by impatient 1960s cooks eager to serve hot food immediately. The practice seemed like unnecessary delay that would only cool the meal. Food science has proven that resting allows muscle fibers to relax and reabsorb juices that cooking drives toward the center. Cutting immediately releases those juices onto the cutting board rather than keeping them in the meat where they belong. A properly rested roast loses far less moisture when carved, remaining juicier and more flavorful than one cut immediately. The internal temperature continues rising during rest, completing the cooking process gently without drying the exterior. The texture improves as proteins set and firm slightly, making carving easier and slices more uniform. Patient cooks who waited 10 to 20 minutes before carving understood through experience what laboratory measurements later confirmed. The wait makes everything taste noticeably better. Deglazing pans with liquid to capture browned bits was considered extra work by 1960s cooks who simply washed their pans after cooking. The fond stuck to the bottom seemed like mess rather than treasure. Culinary science reveals that those browned residues contain concentrated flavor compounds created through the Maillard reaction, the same chemistry that makes roasted and grilled foods taste so appealing. Adding wine, stock, or even water to a hot pan dissolves these compounds and incorporates them into sauces that elevate simple dishes to restaurant quality. The technique requires no additional ingredients, just the residue already in the pan and liquid to release it. Professional chefs consider deglazing fundamental, building entire sauce traditions around capturing every bit of developed flavor. Grandmothers who added splashes of liquid to their pans and scraped up the brown bits weren't being fussy. They were practicing technique that transforms ordinary cooking into something genuinely memorable. Blanching vegetables briefly in boiling water before other preparations was dismissed as unnecessary extra steps by convenience-focused 1960s cooks. Steaming or microwaving seemed simpler and faster. Food science confirms that blanching serves multiple purposes that shortcuts cannot achieve. The brief hot water exposure deactivates enzymes that cause vegetables to deteriorate, preserving color, texture, and nutrients during storage or freezing. Blanching removes surface bacteria and dirt more effectively than washing alone. The process sets chlorophyll in green vegetables, keeping them vibrant rather than drab. For stir-frying, blanched vegetables cook more evenly and quickly because they've been partially tenderized. The ice bath that follows stops cooking immediately, preventing mushiness. Traditional cooks who blanched before freezing, canning, or further cooking understood that this extra step produced noticeably superior results that justified the minimal additional time and effort involved. Seasoning food throughout the cooking process, rather than just at the end, was considered excessive by some 1960s cooks who believed final adjustment was sufficient. Adding salt early seemed unnecessary when you could simply season at the table. Culinary research shows that layered seasoning produces fundamentally different and superior results. Salt added early penetrates deeply into meat and vegetables, seasoning throughout, rather than just on the surface. Spices and aromatics added at different stages release different flavor compounds, creating complexity impossible to achieve with final seasoning alone. Early salting of beans and grains improves texture by strengthening cell walls during cooking. The total amount of salt needed often decreases when added in stages because the flavor distributes more evenly. Experienced cooks who tasted and adjusted throughout understood that building flavor in layers created dishes that single-point seasoning could never match. Toasting spices in dry pans before grinding was considered unnecessary by 1960s cooks using pre-ground spices from supermarket shelves. Fresh grinding seemed old-fashioned when convenient alternatives existed. Food chemistry confirms that heat transforms spice compounds dramatically, releasing volatile oils and creating new flavor molecules through the Maillard reaction. Toasted cumin tastes fundamentally different from raw cumin, deeper, more complex, with notes impossible to achieve otherwise. The heat also makes spices more brittle and easier to grind finely. Freshly ground toasted spices release their aromatics immediately upon contact with food, while pre-ground versions have lost most volatile compounds to evaporation. Traditional cooks who took time to toast and grind weren't being inefficient. They accessed flavor dimensions that convenience products simply cannot provide. The extra minutes transformed ordinary dishes into something extraordinary. Making gravy from pan drippings rather than using packaged mixes was considered old-fashioned by 1960s convenience-focused cooks. Instant gravy promised consistent results without the skill that traditional methods required. Real pan gravy contains flavor compounds developed during roasting that no commercial product can replicate. The fond, drippings, and rendered fat carry concentrated meat essence that forms the foundation of genuinely satisfying gravy. Deglazing with stock or wine captures every bit of developed flavor from the roasting process. The roux made from drippings creates silky texture while incorporating all those precious compounds. Packaged mixes rely on artificial flavors and thickeners that approximate but never equal the real thing. Grandmothers who whisked flour into pan drippings weren't being stubborn. They were creating something that convenience products can only imitate poorly. The depth of authentic pan gravy remains unmatched. Using wooden cutting boards and utensils was condemned by health authorities who promoted plastic as more sanitary and easier to clean. Wood seemed porous and likely to harbor bacteria that plastic would resist. Research has completely reversed this assumption, showing that wooden surfaces possess natural antimicrobial properties that plastic lacks. Bacteria pulled into wood's porous structure die rather than multiply, while bacteria on plastic surfaces survive and transfer to food. Wooden boards resist knife scarring better than plastic, maintaining smooth surfaces that don't trap contaminants. The natural compounds in certain woods actively inhibit bacterial growth. Families who kept their grandmother's wooden cutting boards weren't being unsanitary. They used equipment that science now confirms offers genuine advantages over the plastic replacements authorities once insisted were superior. Cooking by feel, smell, and appearance rather than precise measurements was dismissed as unreliable by 1960s home economists promoting standardized recipes. Intuitive cooking seemed imprecise compared to scientific approaches. Yet experienced cooks develop sensory awareness that no thermometer or timer can replace. The sound of proper searing tells when a pan is hot enough. The smell of browning indicates Maillard reaction progress. The feel of dough reveals gluten development. The appearance of reduced sauces shows proper consistency. These skills develop through practice and attention, creating cooks who adapt to variable ingredients that recipes cannot anticipate. Grandmothers who knew by sight when bread was ready weren't being imprecise. They possessed refined judgment that rigid adherence to recipes cannot develop. Traditional cooking wisdom recognized that real skill comes from engaged attention. Tomato juice as a soup-based starter was one of those ideas that seemed too simple to matter, until you tried it. When canned broth was hard to find or too expensive, people needed something flavorful, shelf-stable, and easy to stretch. Tomato juice fit the bill perfectly. It added color, acidity, and a rich, savory base that made even the most basic vegetable soup taste like it had simmered for hours. It was especially popular in the 1940s and 1950s, when canned juices were lining grocery shelves and meat was either rationed or just plain pricey. Recipes would call for a cup of tomato juice, some diced potatoes or cabbage, and maybe a scoop of rice or beans. Suddenly, dinner was done. You could serve it with crackers or cornbread, or even pour it over noodles if you had them. It was quick, clean, and cost next to nothing. Some families even poured leftover tomato juice from canned tomatoes right into the pot. Waste not, want not. These soups were humble, but they were hearty, and sometimes that is all you needed, especially when times were tight. The secret of grease preserves is one of those survival tricks that almost defies belief today. After cooking meat, Native American chefs would save every drop of rendered animal fat, pouring it carefully over shredded or chopped pieces of the meat inside clay pots or animal bladders. Once sealed, the fat hardened into a protective barrier that kept bacteria and air out, preserving the meat for weeks, even months. This was not just storage. It was insurance against famine, sickness, and scarcity. Meat preserved this way stayed rich, flavorful, and nutritious, providing vital energy when fresh food was impossible to find. Every time someone dipped into a pot of grease preserves, they were eating a lesson in patience, gratitude, and survival. But even the best preserved meat needed help lasting through long journeys or seasons, and sometimes the land itself offered the perfect cold pantry, hidden just beneath your feet. Making coffee with eggshells may sound strange now, but it was an old trick that made sense in its time. Your grandfather would save clean eggshells, crush them, and stir them into the pot of boiling coffee grounds. The shells drew out bitterness, settled the grounds, and left the coffee clearer and smoother. It was especially common when brewing coffee over campfires or on stovetops without filters. The calcium in the shells worked like a natural clarifier, making the drink easier on the stomach. Back then, coffee was precious and no one wanted to waste it or choke down a bitter cup. This trick gave every pot a mellow flavor that store-bought blends could not match. It was simple, cheap, and effective, the kind of trick passed down by word of mouth rather than written in a book. It showed that clever thinking could turn even the most ordinary morning into something quietly remarkable. Orange sherbet layered parfaits were the kind of dessert that looked fancier than they really were, which was exactly the point. Church ladies had a way of turning inexpensive sherbet into something that felt like a treat from a restaurant. Layered in tall glasses with whipped cream or fruit, they were colorful and refreshing. The bright orange against white cream made them eye-catching on tables lined with potluck desserts. Sherbet was cheap and kept well in the freezer, making it a practical ingredient for families on tight budgets. By layering it with simple pantry items, women created parfaits that kids loved and adults admired. The trick was all in the presentation because the flavors were simple, but the look was memorable. Parfaits like these were a favorite in summer when something cold and light was most welcome. At gatherings, trays of parfaits could be carried in and set down with pride. They proved that even with limited resources, you could bring joy and elegance to a table. They were clever, thrifty, and full of charm, just like the women who made them. Iceberg lettuce boats looked like diet food, but they were actually a clever way to stretch expensive proteins. Housewives would hollow out big crisp leaves and fill them with cottage cheese, tuna salad, or chopped ham, making one head of lettuce feed a whole family. They appeared on diet plates in diners, but at home they were a showcase of thrift dressed up as something stylish. A tray of these boats made it seem like you had spent hours planning, when in reality it was just a matter of scooping and spooning. They were crisp, fresh, and cheap, which checked every box for a busy mother trying to keep meals interesting. Cottage cheese and canned fruit made them light enough for summer lunches, while ham or tuna made them hearty for a quick dinner. Guests thought they were trendy, kids thought they were fun, and husbands thought they were health-conscious, which meant everyone went home happy. It was not about the lettuce at all. It was about the illusion that this was something fresh and new. That was the true genius of 70s cooking tricks, making ordinary food feel like a special creation. Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Ash baking was one of the most brilliant and humbling ways Native American cooks created bread without any tools, fancy ovens, or even a proper surface. When you needed to eat, you did not wait for the perfect setup. You dug into the earth itself. Dough was shaped into rough rounds and placed directly onto a bed of hot ashes and embers, then gently covered with more hot ash. The bread would cook slowly, surrounded by a blanket of heat, becoming crusty on the outside and pillowy soft on the inside. If a little ash clung to it, so be it. You brushed it off and bit into a smoky, earthy flavor that modern kitchens would pay fortunes to recreate. It was cooking stripped down to its raw, purest form, food born right from fire and earth. Today, ash-baked bread might seem primitive, but taste one bite of it, and you will understand exactly why this method lasted for centuries. And if you thought bread from ash was wild, wait until you hear how native chefs used cactus to transform even the toughest, most stubborn pieces of meat into buttery, tender feasts. Stretching meat with oats was a kitchen practice that meant the difference between one dinner and several. Ground beef was expensive, and there were times when even the smallest amount had to feed the whole family. Your grandfather knew that mixing rolled oats into the meat gave it more bulk, held it together, and made it go further. The oats also absorbed seasonings and juices, adding a nutty texture that made burgers, meatballs, and meatloaf taste heartier. It was an honest way to keep plates filled without spending more. This was not some hidden secret either, since many cookbooks and neighbors shared the idea during lean times. Oats were cheap, easy to store, and always available, so they became the natural choice. A single pound of beef could now serve twice as many people, and no one complained because the flavor was still there. Families grew up on this trick, never realizing how much it saved their parents each week. Cucumber vinegar soaks were a quick way to brighten the table when fresh vegetables were hard to come by. Church ladies sliced cucumbers thin, tossed them into vinegar and sugar, and left them to chill. After just a short soak, the cucumbers took on a crisp, tangy flavor that worked perfectly alongside heavy casseroles or fried meats. The sharpness of the vinegar balanced out starchy or greasy dishes, making meals feel lighter and fresher. During summer potlucks, bowls of these cucumbers were always emptied fast because they were refreshing and simple. It was an inexpensive side that felt new every time, no matter how often it appeared. The trick was that the vinegar kept the cucumbers firm and flavorful, so they could be made ahead without going limp. Families often passed around jars of these during hot months, and many recipes appeared in community cookbooks. Kids grew up expecting that every picnic table would have a plate of them. They were not just salad, but a cooling relief in the middle of sweltering afternoons. It was proof that even the simplest tricks could feel like a luxury when done with care. Oyster cracker toppers were one of those little tricks that 70s housewives leaned on to stretch both flavor and budget. Breadcrumbs were not always on hand, and store-bought toppings could be pricey or just out of reach, so oyster crackers became the solution. They were smashed or crushed and sprinkled over bubbling casseroles or stews, adding that extra crunch that made the dish feel complete. You might laugh at the idea today, but this was the kind of smart move that turned leftovers into something that felt like dinner instead of scraps. Kids would dig in without complaint, and husbands coming home from work thought it was just another fancy touch their wives had picked up. All it took was a small bag of crackers to dress up a whole pot of food, which meant one trip to the store could carry through an entire week of meals. They were also handy to keep around for soups, giving even the most basic broth that texture people craved. A clever cook in the 70s knew it was not about what you had, but what you could make it look and taste like. Mashed potato donuts were a wartime favorite that combined comfort, frugality, and just enough indulgence. They started as a way to use up leftover mashed potatoes, especially the cold, sticky kind no one wanted to reheat. Mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, and spices, the dough was rolled out, cut into rings, and fried until golden. The potatoes made them tender on the inside, with a crisp outer shell that held up well to a dusting of powdered sugar or a quick dip in glaze. The texture was somewhere between a cake donut and a fritter, and they were surprisingly filling. These showed up in cookbooks throughout the 1940s and 1950s, usually listed under budget baking or no-waste desserts. They were popular at church events, bake sales, and family breakfasts, where everyone needed something sweet and satisfying. People even used boxed instant mashed potatoes when real ones were in short supply. It was not just about saving money, it was about turning scraps into something worth looking forward to. And in kitchens where not a spoonful could be wasted, these donuts made every bite count. The trick of smoking corn husks for deep, sweet flavor might sound simple today, but it was revolutionary in the world of ancient cooking. Corn was life to many native communities, not just a crop, but a living gift. Every part of it was precious, especially the husks. By soaking them lightly and laying them over hot coals or wrapping food inside them, cooks could infuse whatever they were making with a smoky, sweet richness that no wood or spice could ever truly replace. Smoking corn husks became a way to turn plain dishes into something sacred, layering that faint sweetness into meats, vegetables, even simple bread. It was an invisible ingredient, a secret handshake between the land and the plate. Today, a few high-end restaurants still use this trick, usually without telling you, because the result feels so natural, so impossibly rich, that diners are left wondering what kind of sorcery they have just eaten. But corn was not the only plant they turned to for hidden flavor and power. If you knew where to look, even the tallest pine trees offered a secret recipe for survival. Keeping lettuce crisp with damp towels was one of those quiet tricks that every grandfather seemed to know without ever needing a manual. Refrigerators with crisper drawers were not common in every household, so a simple towel soaked lightly in water became the next best thing. lettuce heads would be wrapped gently and stored in a cool corner or ice box. The damp cloth slowed wilting, kept leaves from drying out, and added days of freshness to a vegetable that otherwise spoiled quickly. Families depended on greens for salads, sandwiches, and suppers, and wasting even one head of lettuce felt like throwing away money. The towel method stretched groceries further and kept meals looking more appetizing. A plate of limp, tired lettuce was never as welcome as one with crisp, bright leaves. This clever trick was taught in kitchens and passed quietly across generations, a testament to making do with little. Today, many people do not even think about it, but back then, a damp towel was the line between waste and dinner. Pineapple cheddar casserole was one of those quirky pairings that defined the era. Housewives mixed sweet pineapple chunks with sharp cheddar cheese, baked it into a casserole, and served it alongside ham or pork at Sunday dinners. The sweet and savory combination surprised many, but it quickly became a favorite in community cookbooks. It was thrifty, since canned pineapple was affordable and cheddar stretched protein-heavy meals further. The dish struck a balance between novelty and tradition, standing out at gatherings while still being comforting. Families came to expect it during holidays, and housewives relied on its dependable ease. Its charm lay in the way it transformed two ordinary ingredients into something unforgettable, sparking conversations at dinner tables across the country. Homemade grape Kool-Aid sherbet was one of those tricks that turned a simple drink mix into a frozen delight for children's socials. Church ladies mixed powdered Kool-Aid with sugar, water, and a little milk, then froze it into a sherbet that looked bright, cheerful, and fun. It cost very little to make, but felt like a special treat, especially in the heat of summer. Kids loved the vivid purple color and tangy sweetness, while parents appreciated that it could be made in large batches with minimal effort. At picnics or Sunday school gatherings, tubs of this sherbet were scooped into paper cups, leaving sticky smiles everywhere. It was a clever way to turn an ordinary drink into something memorable, stretching one packet of mix into enough dessert for dozens. The trick also reflected the resourceful spirit of the times, proving that fun did not require fancy ingredients. Homemade grape sherbet became a simple joy tied to fellowship, childhood, and the warm memory of church community. Preserving herbs in salt was a quiet tradition in many kitchens. Fresh herbs wilted quickly, and refrigeration was not always dependable. To keep them useful, your grandfather would layer sprigs of herbs in jars with coarse salt. The salt drew out moisture, kept them green, and captured their flavor for months. Later, when soups or stews needed seasoning, a pinch from the jar carried the taste of summer gardens into winter meals. It was a simple preservation method, but it worked reliably, and the salt itself became flavored too. This made cooking more vibrant even when fresh supplies were long gone. Families treasured these jars, sometimes treating them as small luxuries when times were lean. It was a reminder that with just salt and patience, even fragile greens could last through the hardest seasons. Today we buy dried herbs in bottles, forgetting that once every home had its own jars tucked away like a hidden pantry of flavor. Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, it was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten. By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself, and if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. Leftover cereal meat coating was a trick that came straight from the back of the box. When breadcrumbs were out and cornflakes had already gone into yesterday's casserole, Cooks got creative with whatever dry cereal they had left. Bran flakes, crisped rice, even plain puffed wheat. They were all crushed, seasoned, and pressed into service as a meat coating. The idea was to roll a cutlet or drumstick in milk or egg, then dredge it through crushed cereal to make a crunchy crust. It was cheaper, often healthier, and surprisingly effective. Some people added parmesan or paprika to the mix to boost the flavor, while others liked the sweetness it brought to pork or chicken. Kids never questioned it, especially if the cereal had been part of breakfast just that morning. These tricks were passed down in hand-me-down cookbooks and on recipe cards that started with, "Use what you have." And that is really what it was about, making dinner work without running to the store. Sometimes the best recipes came from the bottom of the box. Gelatin whipped desserts were one of those clever inventions that took something simple and made it feel like a treat you could be proud to serve at a church potluck. By folding whipped evaporated milk into gelatin, church ladies transformed a basic box of flavored powder into something airy and mousse-like. It was light, colorful, and just sweet enough to feel like dessert without being too heavy. This trick was especially popular because evaporated milk was cheaper and lasted longer on pantry shelves than cream. It was also easier to find during times when fresh dairy was not always available. Families loved how the mixture set into a fluffy texture that felt luxurious, even though it was made from very humble ingredients. At socials, these dishes often arrived in bright pastel shades that lit up the serving table. Kids thought they were getting a fancy pudding, while adults appreciated how economical the recipe was. It was the kind of clever little trick that stretched ingredients and made people smile. The fact that it took almost no time to prepare only added to its appeal. Looking back, it was not just dessert, but a symbol of creativity in community kitchens. Stuffed bell peppers with rice were the ultimate thrifty oven dish. Housewives stretched a small amount of ground meat by mixing it with rice, tomato sauce, and seasonings, stuffing it all into colorful peppers. What might have been only enough for two became a meal for an entire family. Baking them together let the flavors mingle, turning cheap ingredients into a dish that felt warm and complete. It was filling, economical, and surprisingly impressive when placed on the table. Housewives knew that recipes like this were about more than saving money. They were about creating meals that carried pride. It became a regular weeknight dinner that required very little but delivered a lot. Families walked away satisfied, and the kitchen stayed under budget. It was a shining example of how thrift and flavor met in perfect harmony in 70s kitchens. Rolled jam pinwheels were a sweet answer to leftover pie dough, making sure no scrap went unused in church kitchens. Instead of tossing out the extra trimmings, women rolled the dough flat, spread it with jam or jelly, sprinkled a little sugar, and baked it into spiraled cookies. The result was crisp on the outside, gooey in the center, and irresistible to anyone nearby. These little pinwheels often became a reward for children hovering around the kitchen, eager for something warm. At church events, trays of them were passed around alongside coffee, proving that even scraps could become a memorable treat. They carried with them the lesson that nothing in the kitchen should be wasted, no matter how small. Each batch was different depending on the flavor of jam on hand, which gave them a charming variety. Rolled jam pinwheels were thrift, tradition, and comfort rolled into one, a little bite of sweetness that showed off everyday cleverness. Using newspaper to ripen fruit was one of those small, clever fixes that worked without fancy gadgets. When tomatoes or bananas were still green, your grandfather would wrap them in newspaper and leave them in a warm corner of the house. The trapped gases and warmth helped them ripen faster and more evenly. It was cheap, practical, and surprisingly reliable. Back then, wasting fruit was unthinkable, so this method gave every harvest a second chance. Families used it to bring in tomatoes from the garden before the frost or to make store-bought bananas ready for baking. The newspaper trick turned waiting days into just a night or two, keeping meals on schedule without spending extra money. It was not something written in manuals, but passed down from experience and observation. Today we buy fruit ready-made, but once upon a time, ripening your own was part of daily life, and everyone knew how. Celery salt on cottage cheese might not sound like much, but for mid-century dieters, it was a little miracle. In the 1950s, cottage cheese was hailed as the queen of health foods, low in fat, high in protein, and endlessly adaptable. But let us be honest, it was bland. Enter celery salt. Just a dash gave it a briny, herby kick that made the whole bowl come alive. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and sprinkled on everything from tomato slices to hard-boiled eggs. But with cottage cheese, it had a real glow-up. This combo became a go-to lunch for housewives watching their waistlines, often served on lettuce with half a pear or a canned peach on top. It looked like a diet plate, but tasted like something more satisfying. You could find this suggestion in health columns, diet booklets, and women's magazines from coast to coast. It was a trick born of scarcity and self-restraint, dressed up to feel like something fancier. Even today, a bite of cottage cheese with a little celery salt feels like stepping into a lunch counter from 70 years ago. Quiet, cool, and just a little strange. Acorn meal might not sound glamorous today, but to Native American cooks, it was a golden ticket to rich, sustaining nutrition. In a world where wheat and cornmeal were not always reliable, acorns from oak trees were gathered in huge numbers, then carefully leached to remove bitterness. The result was a fine, nutty flour that could be used to make breads, thick soups, or even hearty porridges. Acorn meal carried a deep, earthy taste that felt heavier and more nourishing than modern flour, and it was packed with oils and minerals that kept bodies strong through brutal winters and hard seasons. It was slow, careful work, but it paid off with food that could last for months. And unlike store-bought flour today, acorn meal reminded every bite of where it came from. But even when bread was needed quickly, native chefs had a trick up their sleeves, heating river stones until they became the perfect natural griddles for making flatbreads on the fly. Dandelion green salad was once a common dish that many families relied on when money was tight or gardens were bare. The tender leaves were gathered from yards or fields in early spring when they were still young and mild in flavor. Mixed with a splash of vinegar, a drizzle of oil, or sometimes even bacon drippings, the salad had a tangy bite that balanced heavier meals. Some cooks softened the greens with a quick sauté before tossing them, while others preferred the raw crunch paired with hard-boiled eggs or crumbled cheese. Children often complained about the bitterness, but thrifty parents knew these wild greens provided valuable vitamins after a long winter of preserved foods. The dish was both frugal and fresh, a reminder that nourishment could be found in the simplest places if you were willing to look. Dandelion green salad carried the spirit of making do with what the earth freely gave. Orange Julius copycats were the mall treat that made its way into every thrifty household blender. Housewives learned that a can of frozen orange juice concentrate, blended with milk, sugar, and sometimes a splash of vanilla, created the same frothy drink without the trip downtown. Children begged for them after school, husbands enjoyed them on hot afternoons, and neighbors saw them as proof that homemakers could replicate anything. The mixture was creamy, sweet, and refreshing, a little luxury that cost only pennies per serving. It was thick enough to pass for indulgent, but still light enough to feel wholesome, which fit perfectly with the health-conscious trends of the decade. Housewives clipped variations of the recipe from magazines and passed them around at church gatherings, each one swearing hers tasted just like the real thing. The magic was not just in the flavor, but in the feeling of beating the system, of making store-bought luxury at home. Canned fruit syrup as sweetener was the secret sauce behind dozens of desserts and drinks when sugar was rationed or expensive. The syrup from canned peaches, pears, or pineapples was thick, sweet, and already full of fruit flavor, so thrifty cooks learned to never throw it away. They poured it into cake batters to replace sugar and milk, used it to thin frosting or sweeten gelatin molds, and even stirred it into coffee or tea. Some recipes called for reducing it slightly on the stovetop to make a more concentrated syrup. Others added cornstarch and used it as a glaze for pound cake or donuts. It was a way to get extra flavor and moisture without using up precious pantry staples. Magazines from the 1940s through the 1970s suggested it often, usually alongside tips for reusing the fruit itself in upside-down cakes or salad toppings. It was a full-circle solution. Nothing wasted, everything sweetened. If you grew up with canned fruit, you probably remember the taste of that syrup more than the peaches themselves. Homemade mayonnaise was one of those tricks that made church ladies feel like magicians in the kitchen. Before jars of mayonnaise were widely available, women learned to whisk oil and egg yolks together until they became a smooth, creamy spread. It was not easy because the mixture could break if handled too roughly, but when it worked, it felt like an accomplishment. Homemade mayonnaise was used in sandwiches, potato salads, and vegetable spreads, bringing a fresh richness that people remembered fondly. It was also far cheaper than buying prepared versions, which made it a smart choice for large families or community meals. Church ladies often passed down tips on how to get the texture right, and recipes appeared in local cookbooks to guide beginners. The flavor was sharper and fresher than store-bought, which gave simple dishes an extra kick. At potlucks, someone always had a mayonnaise-based salad that was proudly made from scratch. It was another reminder that thrift and taste did not have to be separate. Making something out of simple pantry items and skill was a badge of honor. It was clever, frugal, and satisfying. Which forgotten cooking trick would you bring back to your kitchen? Drop your answer in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another trip down memory lane with us.